Hi everyone. Today we're going to be looking at a brief introduction of a specific architectural feature that you'll see throughout the course, and that is columns. So we'll see that there are a lot of varieties of columns, and we kind of use this as our touchstone as we move throughout the semester. So let's begin with the basic parts of a column. There are three basic parts, and each of the parts has lots of subdivisions, but for us today we'll just look at it in very general terms. So the first part of a column is the capital, and this is where we'll see most of the variety of a column comes from. And you can see there's lots of smaller parts that all have their own names, but again, we're not going to look at that today. The second part of the column is the shaft, and that's the long portion of the column itself. And finally, we have the base, and again, depending on the architecture that this column is part of, we'll see different styles of bases. So there are a lot of types of columns. There's what we consider the column proper. This is a freestanding column that you can tell appears where the cross beams would sit, and it would hold up structures. Then we have engaged columns, and you can tell these are not freestanding, right? These are part of the wall. They do still do some support work, but they're a little more decorative than supportive. And finally, we have pilasters. Pilasters are, and we have one full column here, but the two back here in the background, they're just really decoration, right? You can tell they're not adding any support to anything. They're meant to look like columns on the wall, but they aren't actually supporting anything. They're just for decoration. We'll begin with the Egyptian columns, and the Egyptians had lots of different styles to their columns, depending on where they were being used. You have to remember the Egyptian period lasted a long time, so there was some variety over that time period. So we have plant-style columns, columns that look like various plants, palm trees, lotuses, papyrus, and non-plant styles. Right? So let's take a brief look at these. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them. But when we talk about fluted columns, and this fluting looked like bundles of papyrus reeds. That's sort of what they were meant to reflect. The fluting is the long lines that you see. That's what's called fluting, right? And at the top of this one, we have the fluting down here, but the top looks like maybe a closed-up lotus, so it's called lotiform. And this one, palmiform and papyriform. Seems pretty obvious, right? It looks like palm tree, looks like papyrus. And again, these are referring mostly to the capitals of the columns themselves. And we have a non-plant style column here called the tent pole. So this is supposed to represent what a pole holding up a tent out in the desert might look like. Very standard. We have the Hathoric and the Osirid columns. Osirid kind of columns, or Osirid, refer to the Egyptian god Osiris, right, god of the underworld. So you'll see his figure holding up the column, right, holding up the structure above him. He actually becomes the column. And here we have the goddess Hathor, who is also very important at certain times of Egyptian history. So the people themselves actually take the place of the column. And you can see there's lots of different parts to the Egyptian column, and they were very colorful, of course. We don't see the color today, that's all worn away, but they were very colorful with lots of hieroglyphics and all sorts of beautiful paintings on them. At Persepolis Palace in modern-day Iran, you can see these beautiful bowls, capitals, and in this smaller image here you can kind of see how the timber would have been laying in two different directions on the top of these capitals. So these columns did support weight. Very beautiful. There are different kinds of Greek and Roman columns. We'll start off with the Minoan columns, and here's a good example at Knossos in Crete. And you can see that these columns, very simple, base, non-fluted shaft, and kind of a cushion up here, not even a full capital. And the columns really are more narrow at the bottom and widen as they work their way up. You can see it a little more on some of the close-up images of the columns at Knossos on the island of Crete. The Doric column, and we'll learn all of these parts later as we get to that part of the Greek history. But you can see they're fluted, very plain style Doric columns, and that it just kind of is distinguished by this flat capital. and the flutes going down the shaft. And again, there's that plain capital. The Ionic column was used as well, fairly similar, a little more fancy pants stuff on the base, and a fancier capital called volutes. They look kind of like ram's horns or scrolls. The Tuscan column was found in the Etruscan buildings, or at least what we could reconstruct of the Etruscan buildings in Italy, before it was even in Italy. And you can see again it has no fluting, very plain, very simple. The Romans also developed fully the idea of a Corinthian capital, and this the capital here. These are called acanthus leaves, very ornate. Sometimes you'll see these capital types mixed together. In the Colosseum, you'll see the different styles of capitals all in the one structure, but in general, most structures preferred one particular, the architect preferred one particular type of capital. And now we'll move on to the medieval world, where we see lots of different types that sort of, particularly towards the end, get a little muddier. It's harder to distinguish one type from the other, but I won't ask you to do that. Historiated columns means that the column itself, or the capital, depicts not just some abstract or organic artwork, but real historical images. So this capital in a medieval church in France shows a depiction of the flight into Egypt of Mary and Jesus, and I guess that's Joseph hauling the donkey along there. And here we see the Caryatids, as these ladies are referred to, these beautiful women holding up one of the porches at the Acropolis. Right? Kind of reminds you of the Hathoric and Osirid columns that we saw in Egypt earlier. We have beautiful Islamic columns called muqarnas, and it's just this lovely. This one here is in a single color, and this one, the same sort of thing happening in like tile work or painted work, makes it just more difficult to see. But this is really what's going on. These just lovely surfaces carved in there. They're just gorgeous. Byzantine columns are again mostly organic. We see the Byzantine columns, the Romanesque, and the Gothic are a little harder to distinguish. You see these kind of forms overlapping throughout. And that is our slideshow of columns.